Welcome back to another edition of the MMA Pick'ems podcast, the premier podcast for UFC breakdowns and betting tips. Guys, people have made a ton of money fading my picks, so get in while you still can because this channel is on a rocket ship right now. We just passed 100 subs, and it'll only be a matter of time before we pass 1 million, so really exciting stuff here. And, speaking of exciting, we do have a very exciting card this weekend. Conor McGregor, Dustin Poirier, the trilogy on what is probably the most stacked Conor card since 205. And I have a weird little theory as to why. I think the UFC is trying to give some of their younger, more exciting prospects a little bit of exposure because, if Conor loses this, I really don't know what his future with the UFC is going to look like. Like, realistically, where would he go from here after a loss? Probably the Diaz trilogy fight, but that's going to be a little weird to market considering, both guys are going to have a combined record of like 2-6 going into that fight. But let's not look too far ahead because we do have a really good card here. A lot of exciting prospects on the card. Sean O'Malley, for one. He really is getting the push from the UFC, but the guy does have the goods to back it up. We also have Michel Pereira and Ilia Topuria on the card. And before that, Sean Brady too. But, unfortunate that fight fell through. Was really actually looking forward to seeing Sean Brady in action versus Kevin Lee. But looks like he got pushed back. And, there are a ton of other good matchups as well. So just all in all, a very, very solid card here. But before we get any further, I do want to do a quick run through of the previous event. As for official picks go, I did get an 8 out of 11 correct, but only profited 0.65 units on the night. I wish it was 6.5 units. Anyways, gonna run through this really quickly here because we did pull the trigger on a number of bets. Kicking off the night, Damir Hadzovic, Yancy Medeiros, fight doesn't go the distance. I felt that both guys had potential durability concerns. Hadzovic with his cardio as well, and both fighters do have some finishing upside, so that was one where I felt that, wouldn't go to the scorecards, and, it did come close on, one or two occasions, but not that close, not too upset with this play here, but moving along, I also put half a unit. I meant to put half a unit. I don't know why this one got locked in twice on Bet MMA Tips, but it did, and I wasn't able to change it, so, that was half a unit for Avila Stoliarenko under 2.5 rounds. Again, another fight where I felt that both fighters had good finishing potential, and this kind of hurt because I took the under 2.5 rounds, but Stoliarenko ended up getting finished in like the last minute, so that kind of stung a bit. But not much more to add there, just kind of unfortunate how that went. So next fight, OSP versus Tanner Boser. I had Boser to win by decision, and that was one where I felt the odds were a little bit off because historically Boser is a decision guy, and the concern was with OSP's chin, but I didn't want to completely count him out after that Jamal Hill loss because Hill can crack, and I didn't feel that Boser was really going to bring that sort of power, but what had happened was I think Boser or OSP might have tired himself out a bit after that initial grappling exchange, and I think that kind of fucked him up, right? Going into this fight, I was kind of banking on it being a slower paced fight, kind of like how the first round played out where, OSP was just a bit timid in there, didn't really want to initiate many exchanges, and Boser would just outpoint him, throughout 3 rounds, but it looked like OSP wanted to, grapple a bit because, it wasn't a terrible idea, after seeing how badly Boser looked off his back, but OSP just doesn't have the gas tank to do it, and I wasn't expecting, I did think that there would be a chance he would look to grapple, but I didn't really expect him to because that wasn't something he's really gone to in his previous fights or most recent fights, and I really just thought he would be a little more conservative with his cardio there, so that ended up not happening, but I do feel that if he hadn't gone to the wrestling, he probably would have lost, or it would have gone to decision if he would just kind of played it conservatively, but he didn't there, and it is understandable seeing Boser just struggle on the ground like that in this previous fight. But the other props that didn't hit, which this one kind of hurt a little bit as well because I took Rakhmonov to win by KO TKO, and I took him to win in the second round as well. And that was a spot where I feel like I had almost gotten the read down to a T, because I had felt that after the first round, Pereira would start to tire, and Akhmedov would really start to put it on him and catch him somewhere in the second round. It's happened quite a bit in a number of Akhmedov's fights, and man, this was the perfect matchup for it to happen to, but unfortunately he went for the submission instead of just kind of flurrying him. I think he could have gotten the stoppage there if he'd done that, and that would have been a pretty crazy swing to the night, because I feel like we were a couple inches away from just having a +5 unit night, but that's just how it is sometimes, and we got to move along here. Ike Villanueva, Marcin Prachnio. I took a half unit stab on Villanueva. I thought that the line was way off. I didn't think either guys were really good fighters. And, Prachnio just caught Ike with a nasty liver kick and just put him out. But up until then, it didn't look like too bad of a bet. Villanueva was doing some solid work, keeping it competitive on the feet. And I think had it gone to a decision, it would have been a pretty close fight. I think that you could have possibly scored it to Villanueva, but who knows? The fight never, went to the decision there. He ended up getting TKO'd there. And not going to lose too much sleep over this bet. But moving right along, Alexander Volkov, Cyril Gane, and what a solid performance by Gane, man. The guy was able to just walk Volkov down at will and pretty much just pressure him the whole fight. Really, Volkov wasn't able to get much going outside of the kicks, and I honestly was really surprised with how effective Gane's pressure was against Volkov. I thought Volkov would look to move forward a little bit more, but it seemed like Cyril Gane just did a really good job of, shutting Volkov down, and I was really impressed with what Gane did there. I'm pretty sold on him at this point. I think he should be able to walk through Lewis, and the fight to make really is Cyril Gane, Francis Ngannou. That would be a very intriguing matchup. Let me know how you guys would line that fight if they did end up getting matched up. And maybe let me know how you guys think that fight would play out. But wrapping up the card, we do still have a couple more to get past. Timur Valiev, Raoni Barcelos. I did take a 1 unit shot on Valiev. Again, I felt the line was super wide there. Valiev, really solid fighter. Barcelos, very high level guy as well. But I felt like Valiev was getting a little bit disrespected with that line. And the fight more or less kind of played out the way I had envisioned. And, some people can argue that the fight potentially was a draw, which, I'm not going to argue with. But ultimately, I just felt it was a close fight, and it definitely was. I did say that while Barcelos, he is very high level. His volume isn't great. And Valiev, the guy is like a really high action pressure sort of fighter, and he does swing heavy. So he ended up winning, I'd say, on the optics in rounds 1 and 3. Got dropped that second round, and that could have been a 10-8, but ultimately the value was on Valiev. And lastly, I did take a 5 unit shot on Shavkat Rakhmonov, Michel Pereira, and not really surprised there. Shavkat, while he is still somewhat unproven in the UFC, I think that Pereira definitely is, he's well past his prime. The guy's a bit old, a little bit washed, and was fighting someone much bigger and much more athletic than him at this point. So Rakhmonov got the job done there. And that's the thing with some of these prospects. Like, if you feel they're legit, they should definitely be able to handle some of the older veterans, so to speak. And, we do see this time and time in the UFC. If they're frauds, they're going to lose to some of the vets. But, I'm not 100% sold on Rakhmonov just yet, but I did feel he had the skill set to handle someone like Pereira at this point in his career. So this will wrap up the recap, and I did go a little longer than I had wanted it to, but it is what it is. Let's get right into the breakdowns now. And kicking off the card, we have Alen Amedovski versus Yaozong. And did I not say this card was stacked? Because the UFC has given us an absolute treat of a fight. We got 2 juggernauts going at it. I think outside of the main event, this is probably the fight people are looking forward to the most. No, but in all seriousness, these guys are pretty bad. I mean, they're low-level fighters, bottom of the barrel, both 0-2 in the UFC, both, pretty bad losses as well. That being said, though, this could potentially be a pretty exciting fight because both of these guys do tend to look to brawl a bit, and both are pretty low-skilled. So We could see a lot of trading here. But taking a look at Amedovski first, so this guy's looked just absolutely terrible so far in the UFC. I mean, he's 0-2, both losses, against John Phillips and Krzysztof Jotko, which very terrible in hindsight. Gets pretty much out-grappled by Jotko for 3 rounds, has really nothing off his back, and really wasn't able to get any sort of offense going in that fight. And then in his fight against John Phillips, he gets knocked out in 15 seconds, giving John Phillips his only win in 6 fights. And that was a pretty bad loss at the time and has aged even worse. And you can make the argument that this guy was the ultimate stepping stone for Khamzat, because if he doesn't get knocked the fuck out in spectacular fashion against Phillips, Phillips likely gets cut and we never see Khamzat just dominate him. I'm only half joking here, but the main takeaway from this is that Amedovski is pretty bad. On the feet, he's got pretty herky-jerky movement and not in a good way. The guy's kind of stiff, pretty wild on the feet. Does seem to have a bit of power, but he does leave his chin up in the air. Obviously, like I said before, his defensive grappling is pretty bad. He doesn't have much off his back. Offensively, it does look like he will shoot a takedown. Has gotten some top control. I think that his offensive grappling is decent, but defensively, he's just not very sound there. So nothing really to get too excited about for this guy, aside from the fact that, he's generally an action fighter. So, with the right opponent, he could put on a pretty exciting fight. And his opponent, Yaozong, likely will oblige him in that department. He is, from what I've seen, a bit of a brawler as well. Although I have seen him look to wall install, look to grapple against opponents. But by and large, this guy is a striker. But again, he's a pretty low level as well. Hasn't had a fantastic UFC run either. Was 0-2 fighting against Cyril Asker and Rashad Coulter, which aren't really good losses in my opinion. So Wu was pretty much dominated in the grappling against Asker, but you do have to consider the fact that he was giving up a ton of size in that fight, and the fight did take place at heavyweight. The guy did not really look like he belonged in that division. He had a ton of flab in that fight. I mean, he had the height going in, but you could tell just by his frame he wasn't really a legit heavyweight. So in his next fight, he gets matched up against Coulter, and this time the fight's taking place at light heavyweight, so the guy's moving down a bit, and he comes in much better shape. You could still see that, he's got a bit of flab on him, but he looked in much better shape than when he came in against Asker at heavyweight. That didn't make too much of a difference, though, because he still got pieced up pretty badly against Coulter, which is not a good look. I mean, his striking is a bit wild. His cardio is a little questionable, too, in my opinion. And I have seen him just resort to wall install when the striking isn't going well. But the biggest issue I have with him is he's got serious T-Rex arms. He's 6'3" with a 72-inch reach. I mean, the guy is pretty much all torso. This guy struggles mightily getting inside the distance without getting pieced up. And, fortunately for him in this matchup, he is going up against Alen Amedovski, and they are fighting at middleweight this time. So he's not giving up, he's not going to be giving up size for sure. He's going to be the much taller fighter, but he won't be giving up a massive reach advantage like in a lot of his other fights. But interestingly enough, Amedovski actually does have the reach advantage, but Yaozong is the taller fighter, so that is mitigated a little bit, but that is kind of an interesting fact there. But as far as this matchup goes, I think it's honestly a pretty close fight. When I first started doing tape for this fight, the line was actually much wider. I think Amedovski was around minus 170, minus 180, and Yaozong was at around plus 150. And at the time, I was contemplating taking a small shot on Yaozong. But where it stands now, I don't think there's any value on Yaozong whatsoever. Amedovski does have quite a bit more experience. Yaozong is a bit younger. He's likely going to be the one that's making more improvements, but not that I'm banking on it or anything. But it's just really hard to take Amedovski. After seeing him get knocked out by Phillips like that. But I do think that Amedovski is the slightly better fighter, but not by much, honestly. I think that if it becomes a really brawly sort of fight, I trust the durability of Yaozong a little bit more, and I do favor Yaozong a bit if he looks to cage push, maybe look to wrestle a bit. I did hear some commentators say that he has a wrestling base. Haven't really seen much from his wrestling though, but if he does look to work his wrestling, I do favor him a bit in the grappling as well. So as far as the pick goes, I think I'm going to have to go with Yaozong here. Not a ton of confidence, but I can't take someone who's gotten beat by John Phillips. So the pick here is Yaozong. And something I do want to mention is I think Yaozong will have a pretty significant size advantage. This fight is at 185, like I said before. So this guy should be in pretty solid shape. I mean, he was in pretty good shape even at 205. So, cutting down an extra 20 pounds, I think he'll be pretty shredded. Probably the most shredded T-Rex you'll see. But in all seriousness, the guy looked pretty big at heavyweight, looked solid at light heavyweight. So I'd have to imagine that at middleweight, he's going to look, pretty shredded in there. So yeah, I think Yaozong can win on the basis of just probably being the more durable fighter if they do get into a firefight, and maybe being able to fall back onto his grappling if he does need to. That said, though, where the line is now, I don't see a ton of value him at 115 here. Back when it was around like 140, 150, there was a bit of value, but where it is now, I just don't think it's really worth it for someone who's 0-2 in the UFC and has not looked really that good. So the pick here is Yaozong, but the time to bet him has long passed. And moving right along, we have Zhalgas Zhumagulov versus Jerome Rivera. And Zhumagulov is the minus 350 favorite. Comeback on Rivera is plus 290. And let's start with Zhalgas first. So this guy, he's had a pretty disappointing UFC run so far. I mean, he hasn't had really just bad performances or anything, but they weren't particularly great either, right? So that's really the issue that I have with him, is that, he's a well-rounded fighter, but he is a bit of a decisionator. And, while he doesn't really ever get blown out in fights, he's not really running away with it either. And he doesn't really seem to show much urgency in his fights. So that's just my biggest gripe with him. Coming into the UFC, I felt that he could have maybe given some guys some trouble, but right now I think we've kind of seen where his ceiling is at the UFC level, at least. Like, he doesn't really have much finishing upside, but he isn't really like a volume striker either. So this guy really is able to just get by on just barely doing enough to win fights. And that was kind of the case, on the regional scene as well, where, he does have some solid regional wins. Some people are going to argue that, there were robberies and stuff, but they were all pretty close fights in my opinion. As far as his skill set goes, he's got pretty good movement on the feet. Does throw a lot of looping shots, and I've noticed that in a number of fights that opponents have had success against him is when he's moving back a little too much, which doesn't look too good on the scorecards. And he is content to attack off his back quite a bit as well. I mean, he'll throw elbows and punches off his back, and before I kind of did favor the volume of that, but it's still just not a good look to be on your back for that long. And when he came into the UFC, I thought he'd potentially be like a fringe top 20 gatekeeper sort of guy, but at 32 at flyweight with the skill set and previous performances, I think he's just barely UFC caliber, if at all. And this fight's going to be really interesting because we'll get to see just whether or not he really belongs in the UFC. Although a win over Rivera honestly won't mean that much. All I know is that if he loses to Rivera, he's most likely going to get cut. And moving on to Rivera, he's had a pretty underwhelming UFC run as well. He's been 0-3, lost 2 of them by a pretty brutal knockout, and then got grinded out by Francisco Figueiredo, who is the brother of Davison, but obviously not quite as skilled. But this guy, he's got got a BJJ base, but he doesn't really seem that good there. As far as the striking goes, he does throw a lot of kicks, but I don't think he uses his range particularly well, considering, he is 5'10 with 72.5-inch reach. So he does usually just tower over guys. We'll have the reach advantage over a lot of guys, but he's not a very good at, managing distance or just really using his length all that well. Ultimately, I just don't think that Rivera is really UFC caliber at all. I mean, he won his Contender Series debut, which got him into the UFC, but he didn't really look impressive whatsoever in that fight. I mean, usually the Contender Series fights are supposed to be showcase fights, and, you're really supposed to, finish these guys, honestly. But that was a very close fight, very back and forth, and he never really put a stamp on that fight, but, he still somehow ended up getting a contract, which, I was a little confused with. Very just honestly unimpressive performance, and has been a bit of a dud in the UFC. But taking a look at this matchup, I just don't think there's any way I could take Rivera here. I think Zhalgas should uh, pretty comfortably beat him on the feet. I think the stand-up, he's going to be, much more aggressive. I think that, he's fought the way higher level of competition. And whereas with, Rivera, who got beat pretty badly in all of his losses, Zhalgas did keep it pretty close in both of his losses and against pretty decent fighters as well in Albazi and Paiva. So yeah, on the feet, I think that Zhalgas should be able to do work. I could see him just cruising to a decision, possibly getting a knockout just because Rivera, he could potentially be chinny at this point. He's been knocked out twice in his last three fights. I do feel the line is a little bit wide just because I think that the way Zhalgas fights, he tends to get into pretty close decisions. That said, though, I don't think that Rivera is really quite on his level. So I think Zhalgas should be able to win just on aggression and volume, and just being, the more technical, more skilled fighter. But I'm just not a huge fan of Zhalgas' style, and that could be a bit detrimental here. But honestly, I think he should coast here. So I got Zhalgas here. I think he is potentially parlayable. The really only concern is his tendency to make fights a little bit close. But that being said, though, he's fighting against really high-level guys, at least guys that are, levels above Rivera. So maybe that won't be as big of a concern this fight. But, I do still have some reservations there. But at the end of the day, I think this should be a pretty safe fight for Zhalgas. I think he should be able to get it done, either, by decision or by knockout. And, it might be a decent parlay piece, but, I don't think there's too many other guys you want to parlay on this card because the rest of the card's looking pretty dicey, honestly. And moving right along, we have Omari Akhmedov versus Brad Tavares. And Tavares is the minus 155 favorite here. Come back on Akhmedov is plus 135. And this is low-key a pretty interesting matchup. Very solid matchup, actually. Kind of surprised that this is this low on the card. But, I think both guys are ranked too. So, yeah, kind of shocked that this is this early in the night. But, yeah, pretty fun matchup here. Both pretty well-rounded, high-level guys. Akhmedov, he's, extremely well-rounded. He's got solid striking. Wrestling is on point too. His jiu-jitsu checks out also. But the issue with him is, he's just not really elite anywhere. That said, though, he doesn't really have any glaring flaws. The biggest knock on him, in my opinion, is the cardio, which, isn't too surprising. The guy is, super jacked. And even then, he actually does a pretty good job compensating for it by being able to maintain a very, workable pace for him. And he is really good at fighting at the pace that he wants. However, if you're able to dictate the pace and really fight at your pace and really look to push him, he will start to tire out. And we saw that on full display against Weidman, where, it was a very grapple-heavy fight, and the guy was just completely gassed in that third round. Weidman was able to take him down and just basically control him on the ground for the remainder of the fight. And, you can give him a bit of a pass that fight because it was against Weidman, who is, really high-level, wrestler. But we did see that, if you're able to push the pace on Akhmedov, he can tire out. But generally, he does a pretty good job of maintaining a solid pace that he could fight at for 3 rounds. But, that being said, he hasn't fought the highest level of guys. He's fought, just relatively I guess, mid-level guys, Zach Cummings, Ian Heinisch, Abdul Razak Al-Hassan, these guys, just very, I'd say, mid-level guys. So he is able to enact his game plan on these guys. His opponent, Tavares, is a very solid striker, in my opinion, very composed on the feet, extremely technical, and he doesn't really overextend. He is very defensively sound as well. Yes, he did get knocked out from a head kick, but, anyone could get knocked out from a head kick, so I don't think you could take too much from that. But, outside of that, he's shown pretty good striking defense. His takedown defense is solid too. We saw that on full display against ACJ, and I believe I did take Tavares in that fight. I knew that historically Tavares has had pretty solid takedown defense, but in that fight he really was able to kick it up a notch and did a really good job of stuffing all of ACJ's takedowns. And the one time he did get taken down, he popped back up to his feet pretty quickly. So yeah, overall I think that Tavares is a pretty solid striker, pretty high-level striker who is well-rounded enough to keep the fight standing where he is most comfortable. But, taking a look at this matchup, I do favor him a good amount. I think the line where it is right now is pretty accurate. I could say that Tavares might be a little bit more of a favorite. I know people aren't going to agree with that because Akhmedov is a really solid fighter as well, but I just feel that Tavares is the much sharper and more technically sound striker. And honestly, I think he's going to be a bit quicker in there as well. I think that, he's probably got the quicker hands. I think that he should be able to land on Akhmedov, pretty easily on the feet. I think he should be beating him to the punch. And, if it stays standing, I think he should be able to cruise to his decision. But, obviously I do think that Akhmedov will look to wrestle. But I do think that Tavares should be able to stuff most of those takedowns. And if he's able to do that, I think his likelihood of winning just goes through the roof, because Akhmedov does his best work when he's able to mix up his wrestling and his striking. But, if you limit him to only having to strike or only having to, being able to grapple, I think he does a lot worse. So I think that if Tavares is able to stuff maybe 3 or 4 takedowns, he'll be in a pretty good spot, because I do think that Akhmedov doesn't have the cardio to just chain like 7 or 8 takedowns together. That said, though, the threat of the takedown can potentially open up the striking a bit for Akhmedov, but ultimately I just feel that Tavares is just a step ahead in terms of the striking, and if he is able to stuff a few takedowns, he'll start to realize a lot more success in the stand-up. But yeah, where the line is at right now, I do feel it is pretty fair. Some money is coming in on Akhmedov, and if I can somehow get Tavares at like a pick'em, I'd probably put a unit and a half on him. But as it stands right now, I just don't see a ton of value, because I do feel that on the feet, while I do favor Tavares, if Akhmedov is able to accumulate a bit of control time against the fence and keep it relatively close with the striking, he could potentially steal rounds that way. So yeah, at minus 150 for Tavares, it's just not a ton of value, but also, plus 130 for Akhmedov isn't like super enticing either. So I think this fight is a pass at the moment, but if the line does close up a bit more and I can get like minus 110, 115 on Tavares, I might just take a shot on him. And in the next fight, we have Jennifer Maia versus Jessica Ai, and Ai is the plus 170 underdog. Maia is the minus 200 favorite, and this is a pretty interesting fight. I actually feel that the line is a bit off, and I do think that there is a bit of recency bias in this matchup as well, right? Because Maia, she is coming off of a loss against Shevchenko, and I think somehow her stock has risen because she did take a round off of her, but I don't know if that's something you could really look into too much, because Maia has been primarily a boxer for most of her UFC career, and if I'm being honest, I don't think that she's that good. I mean, she's got solid boxing, but I don't think she's like elite or really high level or anything. She does have black belt in jiu-jitsu and does have jiu-jitsu base, I believe, and she does have a submission win over Calderwood, but that was honestly more on Calderwood than it was on Maia, because Calderwood was the one who shot on her, even though I think she was having a bit of success on the feet. So just, kind of poor fight IQ on Calderwood's part. But, prior to that, Maia didn't have a finish in 5 years. So, in fact, I don't think she's had a finish at all in the UFC outside of that submission. So Maia's primarily just been a decisionator and primarily a boxer so far in the UFC. And, on the feet, obviously, she will throw a few leg kicks. We'll look to cage push a bit. And, she did have a bit of success against Shevchenko in that one round, but historically, she's been pretty much a boxer. And, as far as the grappling goes, she's really only had 2 takedowns in her UFC career. And while her grappling is at a pretty high level, she's not a really high level wrestler or anything. She's not going to look to chain takedowns together. She's not even going to look to go for the single leg or the double or anything. Basically, what I'm trying to say is she's not really looking to proactively wrestle in any of her fights. It's kind of opportunistic at times, but for the most part, like I've said over and over again for this breakdown, she has been a boxer pretty much. And really, for her to look like minus 200 favorite, I think she's going to have to really consistently go to the grappling this fight. But she hasn't really shown to be able to do that. So I don't know if that's going to be the game plan coming in. Whereas with her opponent, Jessica Ai, she's very one-dimensional. She's just primarily a striker. She throws lots of, straight punches in there, will throw kicks, does seem to have a bit of pop in her shots, but all in all, just a pretty one-dimensional striker, honestly. And, she is on a 2-fight lose streak, and you could make the argument she's on a bit of a decline, but you do have to look at some of the matchups she's been in. So in one of those fights, it was against Calvillo, who is a really solid wrestler, was able to take her down and control her there on the mat. And, she was pretty aggressive with her takedowns as well. And then in her most recent fight, it was against Calderwood, who is a volume striker, got that point fighting style and was pretty much just out volume and outpointed in that fight. And stylistically, I don't think Maia really falls into either of those categories. She's more of a pressure boxer, in my opinion, similar to Araujo, in the sense that they both like to move forward and wing those big hooks and do have like a very strong grappling base that they could fall back to. So yeah, on the feet, I think this is a pretty close fight. And, I'm going to sound a little crazy here, but I do think that Ai has a slight advantage on the feet. I think that, she throws a lot of just jabs and 1-2s and kicks that could potentially give Maia a lot of trouble. She'll be the slightly taller, longer fighter, so I think that her straight punches will likely get to her target much quicker, much faster than some of Maia's hooks. And honestly, I see Maia getting touched up every time she tries to close the distance against Ai. So I think on the feet, I do slightly edge it towards Ai, and in the grappling, obviously, I do give to Maia, but I think that it is a pretty competitive fight on the feet. And history has shown that Maia is pretty content to keep a fight standing for 15 minutes. So if that is the case, I think all the value is on Jessica Ai. And I'll probably get a bit of flack here because, Ai is, honestly, she's not a good fighter either. But let's be real here. Jennifer Maia is not that good either, okay? So yeah, I got Ai winning here by a controversial split decision. So yeah, I'm going to side with Ai here, and I have already put half a unit on her at plus 170. I just think the line is a bit off. I'd only cap Maia at around like minus 140 or so. Obviously, I think that if she really aggressively goes to the grappling, she could look like a bigger favorite, but I just don't think that's going to happen. I think that on the feet, it'll be a pretty competitive fight, and I do think that the value is with Ai at that point. So, yeah, I do have half a unit on Ai, but ultimately this is Jessica Ai we're talking about. Don't go too crazy betting her because she is a pretty low-level fighter. So, yeah, not a bet I'm super proud of, but I do see a bit of value there. And moving right along, we have Ryan Hall versus Ilia Topuria. And Topuria is the minus 235 favorite. Come back on. Hall is plus 195. And let's start with Hall first. So, what can I say about this guy? I think he's definitely a bit of a fan favorite at this point. He's developed a bit of a cult following, and I completely understand it. The guy's got very slick jiu-jitsu, loves to throw those spinning attacks on the feet, does his little shoulder shrug, and looks like a character out of The Office. Just the most unassuming looking guy, but is capable of just destroying every ligament in your ankle. So this guy is definitely a very interesting fighter, to say the least. But, this might rub some people the wrong way since I do know he has got a lot of fans, but I just don't think he's that good of a mixed martial artist. On the mat, he's definitely very dangerous, very good at getting those leg locks. But on the feet, he is pretty much just limited to throwing those spinning kicks. And while it does look flashy, those are generally pretty low percentage moves and are pretty telegraphed. So, against better fighters, they should be able to get out of the way relatively easily. And as far as the heel hooks go, he's got a ton of them on his record, but outside of BJ Penn, who was, pretty shot at that point, he's fighting pretty low-level fighters. He's able to pull it off on guys who are, very low-level. And even his wins in the UFC are against guys who are well past their prime, and fighters like Darren Elkins and Gray Maynard, and very low-level guy in Artem Lobov. And honestly, I think the guy is a bit of a meme at this point. Very dangerous heel hooks, but outside of that, I just don't think he has really much to offer. And if I'm being completely honest, I just don't think his UFC run has been really all that impressive either. The guy's got a win over Artem Lobov against Gray Maynard, who, that was just such a weird fight. He kept going for Imanari rolls, but didn't really land any of them. And Maynard just didn't really look like he knew what he was doing in there. He never really punished Hall when he missed on all those Imanari rolls. Like, he could have just gone and kicked his legs a bit, maybe even gotten into his guard and accumulated some top control time, but he wasn't able to do anything that fight. And in the other 2 fights, Hall just goes on to beat a very washed BJ Penn and Darren Elkins. But yeah, I do have to hand it to him. The guy's got a dangerous leg submission game. Does have some flashy kicks, but really outside of that, I haven't really been impressed with his overall game. His opponent, Ilia Topuria, is a pretty well-rounded prospect in my opinion. Very high-level jiu-jitsu. I believe he does have a black belt. His wrestling is pretty solid as well. His boxing is pretty good as well. He hits pretty heavy on the feet, very explosive. He is also pretty solid at mixing in the combinations. So just all around a really solid fighter, very well-rounded. The only issue that I really have with him is his striking defense. He's extremely hittable, and while he has shown good recoverability, I don't think that it's very sustainable. Against higher level guys or guys with solid striking, I think they could really take advantage of that, but I just don't think that Hall is that high level of a striker to really take advantage of some of Topuria's striking tendencies. But Topuria, he has been hurt, he has been dropped before, and he does eat a lot of clean shots, actually. So that is definitely something to keep in mind going forward. But for this matchup, I don't think it'll be too big of an issue because most of Hall's striking is going to come from those kicks, and those are pretty telegraphed, and the windup is pretty big on them. Against someone who is likely going to be a bit quicker in there, I think that Topuria is going to be seeing those coming from a mile away and should be able to avoid those. So the biggest threat that I think Hall poses is going to be from those heel hooks, but from someone like Topuria, who's got a black belt as well, I don't think that it's going to be that easy just getting a heel hook off on him. And unless Topuria got his black belt from a McDojo, I think he should be able to stay safe as far as the grappling goes. And I am aware there are levels to black belts, but unless Topuria is a complete fraud, I do believe he should stay defensively responsible and really just avoid the submission. And it's not like Hall's just going to insta-sub anyone that he can get his hands on. There's been a number of fights where, he was able to go to a decision, notably in the Saul Rogers, Gray Maynard, Artem Lobov, and Darren Elkins fight. So it's not like if this guy gets his hand on you, it's over or anything. So I think that if Topuria is honestly able to just stay defensively responsible, he should be able to avoid those heel hooks. And on the feet, I do favor Topuria a little bit more. I think he's the more explosive striker. I think he's the more dynamic striker, honestly. He's shown a lot more in his striking than I've seen from Hall. And if he's able to just crowd Hall, really pressure him, it's going to take away a lot of the kicking game for Hall. And anytime Hall goes for those Imanari rolls, he could definitely look to punish him. Possibly look to knee him in the head when he's diving for those Imanari rolls, really try and get the timing down on that. And I feel that if Topuria is confident in his jiu-jitsu, he could definitely engage Hall on the ground. I mean, we saw Saul Rogers have a lot of success just being in top position, getting some control time over Hall. And I do think that if Hall is very persistent with his Imanari rolls, I think that Topuria can just honestly engage him in his guard and lay on top of him and just kind of ride him out for the remainder of the round, because unless you're a complete scrub on the ground, it's kind of hard to get a submission off your back. So ultimately, I do have Topuria winning here. I think Topuria could win a decision or potentially even knock Hall out. I think the only way Hall really wins this is if he's able to land one of those spinning kicks or is able to get one of those heel hooks. But I feel those are honestly pretty low percentage moves. And we've seen that when Hall isn't able to pull off the heel hook, his offense is honestly pretty limited. And against someone like Topuria, I think that, Topuria should be able to just really outwork him on the feet. And I guess the other concern really is the mentality of Topuria coming in, because a lot of Hall's previous opponents, they kind of freeze up against him. I think they respect his jiu-jitsu quite a bit, and so they don't really want to overextend against him. They tend to freeze up against him. And, with Topuria, if that happens, then I can see Hall potentially, squeaking away with the decision. But if Topuria is aggressive, I do think that he'll have a pretty good chance of getting the win here. So, yeah, I think that if Topuria, he comes in and pressures Hall, obviously, stay safe in there. But, if he comes in with the pressure, I do think that he should be able to coast to a pretty comfortable win here. So the pick here is Topuria, and I do actually have a 5-unit bet placed on him at, I believe, around minus 220, minus 230 or so. Yeah, I think that outside of some crazy high percentage move, I do think that Topuria should win. And moving right along, we have Dricus du Plessis versus Trevin Giles, and this is a pick'em fight, minus 110 both ways. So Duplessis, he had a pretty weird UFC debut in my opinion. He definitely looked a bit jittery and tense in there. I think the commentators were pointing it out too, but the guy definitely looked a bit stiff. It looked like some of the kicks he was throwing was even kind of throwing himself off balance. He was giving a lot of big reactions to feints and stuff, but ultimately he was able to get the KO in there. But honestly, he wasn't looking too great up until that point. And I also had to dig a little bit for some of his regional footage, and even in those fights, he hasn't looked particularly good either. On the feet, he's got a solid kicking game. He's got good counterpunching as well, but overall, his striking does seem a little bit stiff to me. Defensively, he is a bit hittable as well. Doesn't seem like he moves his head all that well, and does tend to shell up a bit when opponents really start to throw at him. And I have seen him hurt and drop before, so that is a bit of a concern here. He does seem to have some good power. I mean, the guy's pretty ridiculously jacked. His timing on his counterpunches is pretty solid as well, but overall, I'm just not very impressed with the guy. His opponent, Trevin Giles, not super impressed with him either. He's pretty well-rounded. He's got, pretty solid boxing, good wrestling as well. But the main issue I have with Giles is he just is super low volume. The guy will spend a good chunk of the fight just not really throwing. But when he does let his hands go, it is pretty slick. The guy's got pretty good combination punching. He's got pretty quick hands, honestly. But ultimately, the guy is really low volume, and I suspect it's because his cardio is actually not that good. And so he just tends to pace himself a bit, so it ends up being a really low-paced fight. But as far as this matchup goes, I do have to slightly lean Giles. I think outside of the volume issues for Giles, I believe he is actually the better fighter. It's just really the inactivity from him that's really putting me off. But all in all, I do think that he is the more well-rounded, the better fighter in there. On the feet, I think that the striking of Giles will be a little slicker. He'll be a little quicker in there. I think that if Giles is able to get his wrestling going as well, he'll have the advantage there. Whereas with Duplessis, I don't think his striking is all that good. I do have to say that Duplessis is going to be the bigger guy in there by a decent margin. I know that he's only got like about an inch or two of height and reach advantage over Giles, but in terms of the frame, Duplessis is way more filled out. The guy is absolutely shredded, whereas with Giles, again, he's not like tiny in there or anything, but I do feel that if Giles really puts in the work, and it's going to be a rough cut, but I do think that he could potentially make like 170. Whereas with Duplessis, the guy is absolutely like shredded at this weight class. So I feel that Duplessis will be the bigger, stronger guy in there, but I do favor the speed of Giles a little bit more though. And ultimately, I do feel that that's what it's going to come down to. I think that Giles will have slightly quicker hands. He'll probably be beating Duplessis to the punch here, and Duplessis is probably going to have a hard time landing some of those clean counter shots. He'll probably have a bit of success with his kicking game, but unless he decides to just clinch up with Giles and just really work him against the cage, I see Giles getting ahead in most of the striking exchanges. So I'm going to have to side with Giles here. I think he wins a very narrow decision. He's not going to run away with it. I don't think he ever really does that, but I think that the judges will likely score the fight in his favor, just because I think that in terms of the striking, he'll probably do a little bit more. So the pick here is Giles, and I haven't decided to bet this fight yet. It's pretty close. I think that Giles at dog odds was not a bad bet, but as it stands right now at a pick 'em, I just am not super confident in Giles at the moment. But if I can get like a plus 115 or so, I think that I might put a little bit on Giles. And moving right along into the next fight, we have Niko Price versus Michel Pereira, and Pereira's the minus 150 favorite. Come back on Price is plus 135. And so let's start with Price first. Price, he's a very fun fighter to watch. The guy is all action, loves to move forward, willing to exchange in the pocket, very hittable, extremely hittable actually. The guy takes a ton of damage in every fight and has, I believe, a negative striking differential, so the guy is taking as much damage as he dishes. He's content to get into a dogfight and just brawl with opponents and can push a pretty high pace. He's definitely one of those fighters who, even though he's got, pretty long limbs, he's pretty tall, he usually does have the size advantage over opponents, but he doesn't really use it all that effectively. He doesn't really like pump up the jab or manage distance all that well. He usually just looks to trade in the pocket. He kind of reminds me a bit of Julian Erosa in that sense. Both guys who are kind of tall and lanky, but don't really use their length all that well, and are pretty much just action fighters. Are possibly a little chinny as well. So I do see a lot of similarities between these guys actually. And I know I did say possibly chinny, but if you look at the knockout losses or the finishes that opponents have had against Price, Vicente Luque twice, not a terrible loss. Luque is very high level. Abdulrazak Alassane, I mean, this guy has massive power. And before the decline, this guy was regarded as one of like the best knockout artists in the UFC. And then Jeff Neal, who is, big power as well. So these are all guys who are knockout artist essentially. And even in the Luque fight, that was actually a doctor stoppage, so it wasn't like he was out cold or anything. So I might actually have to roll back what I said about Niko Price potentially being chinny, because the only guys finishing him are just the absolute powerhouses. And his opponent, Michel Pereira, he's a pretty big dude, does seem to have some power, but I don't think he's got quite the stopping power of some of the guys that Price has faced, notably like Neal or Alassane. Granted, I do think that Pereira does have some power, just not quite at that level. But Pereira, the guy's a pretty fun fighter to watch as well. I mean, the guy is quite a character, actually. The guy's out there dancing, likes to throw a lot of spinning attacks, will do backflips in the cage, rolling thunder, the Showtime kick, jump off the fence, Superman punch sort of deal. The guy's a showman through and through, but I think underneath the flashy techniques and the flair, he is a pretty skilled fighter in my opinion. His hands are quick. He's got a sharp one too. His kicking game is pretty solid as well. He's actually got decent footwork in there. So yeah, I'd say outside of those just flashy spinning attacks, the guy's got a solid base in striking. The cardio is a bit of a concern, but I think it's made a lot worse by the fact that he throws a lot of spinning attacks. I think if he cuts back on it quite a bit, he should be able to pace himself pretty well for a 3-rounder. And before, I would classify Pereira as a somewhat unreliable fighter because of his style and just some of the flair he brings to the octagon. And, he could still be, but, after that Chaos Williams fight, he did show a side to him that was a lot more composed, a lot more measured, a fighter that was able to stick to a game plan. And I did take him in that Chaos Williams fight, actually. I did feel that he was the better striker, but ultimately I think what made the fight really close was the fact that he really did respect the power of Williams, and he did end up eating a few shots from him that really kind of, I guess, stunned him and really made him focus and realize, this guy's serious, can't be jumping around in there doing backflips against someone who could just absolutely take your head off. So, he did show a good amount of growth in that fight and has shown that, he's matured a bit in the octagon. But taking a look at this matchup, I do think he's got his work cut out for him in Niko Price, who, I don't think he's a really high-level fighter, but he is, he does have a ton of experience. And at this point in his career, I do think that he is creeping close to that veteran sort of status, even though he only has 14 fights. He's got, I think 7 or 8 UFC fights, probably more. And he's fought a good amount of guys in there that are divisional mainstays, right? Like Luque, a washed cowboy, Jeff Neal, Tim Means, Alassane, Randy Brown. So all guys who are, still in the UFC, still really solid guys, solid fighters. Whereas with Pereira, the guy, while he has looked pretty solid so far, he's beaten really no one of note. I mean, Chaos Williams, probably his best win, but I really don't rate Chaos Williams all that well at this point. I think he's a big power guy. It's not very technical, but, still a dangerous fighter. So a win over him is solid, but that was a really close win. Zelim Madaev, who's, I think, really bad. Diego Sanchez, where it was a pretty unfortunate fight. I mean, he was dominating Sanchez until Sanchez ate an illegal knee and looked for a way out. Pulled an Aljo before it was cool. And before that, he lost to Tristan Connolly as a massive favorite. The guy gassed himself out doing those spinning attacks, backflips and shit. And then UFC debut, he wins against Danny Roberts, lands a flying knee. So all in all, the guy hasn't really fought the best fighters, whereas Niko Price's body of work is, I'd say, much more impressive than Pereira. But, skill for skill, I do think that Pereira is the better fighter here. So as far as a pick, I do have to side with Pereira. I think that I think he's got it on the feet. And, I do have to slightly favor him in terms of his athleticism and the youth. I mean, the guy looks like he's 35, but he's actually only 27, so still very young. Still a lot of room for improvement, and he did show improvement in his last fight. So, so I think the guy's got a lot of upside. That said, though, Price is going to be a tough fight for him because Price, he'll really look to move forward, and he'll definitely look to be pressuring. So if Pereira is able to stifle some of the volume of Price, I think that he'll have a lot of success. But with that said, it will be difficult because Price, the guy will continue to move forward, and he will take damage to give damage. So it's really going to be up to Pereira to really punish Price for just moving forward so recklessly. And, the concern with Pereira partially is the cardio. And, if he isn't able to keep up with the pace of Price, I see Price potentially, being able to pull away in the latter half of the fight. But I think it's going to be important for Pereira to really control the pace in this fight. And ultimately, I do think that he'll have a good amount of success in the striking, because if an old washed cowboy can land 113 significant strikes on Price and tie with him, granted, it was an eye poke point deduction, I think that Pereira should be able to pull away in the striking and likely win a decision. I wouldn't be completely surprised if he got the knockout, but I think it will likely go to a decision. As far as betting tips go, I am looking at Pereira here. I don't really love the minus 150 price tag. I think where it is, it's pretty fair. Maybe there's like a little bit of value left on Pereira, but I'd like to get him at less than at least minus 140 if I want to take a shot on him. But yeah, I like Pereira here. I think he should be able to win the decision. And headlining the prelims, we have Max Griffin versus Carlos Condit. And Griffin is the minus 190 favorite. Comeback on Condit is plus 165. And man, this is a really solid matchup, actually. A pretty underrated fight, in my opinion. Honestly, I kind of like the matchups that they've been given Condit recently. Very winnable fights for him. But let's start with Condit first. So the guy's a legend of the sport. He's very slick on the feet, still seems to have his power. He is quite a bit past his prime, but I do think that he is still dangerous on the feet. And, historically, he's had a pretty bad ground game. His takedown defense is pretty awful and has a pretty bad habit of staying on his back for, too long. I actually don't think his ground game is that bad. He just doesn't really have much urgency to get off his back, though. His opponent, Griffin, is pretty well-rounded. His striking is solid. He fights well behind the jab and does keep it pretty tight in there. Honestly, I feel his striking is actually a bit underrated. Even in his losses, he's able to keep it pretty competitive on the feet, and against lower-level guys, he's just able to piece them up. His wrestling is pretty solid, too. I don't think he's got particularly high-level wrestling, but I have seen him look to go for takedowns. With that said, though, I don't think that his top control is that great. We've seen time and time again against other fighters, they've been able to pop up pretty quickly, and I think a lot of his takedowns are against some pretty low-level guys in, I'm blanking on the name, but I believe it was Zalim Imadaev was one of them, was able to consistently take him down. But even in that fight, it was getting a little sketchy because he wasn't able to hold him down, spent a lot of energy having to just peel him back to the ground, and Imadaev was really coming on strong that fight. So the takeaway here is that Griffin, he can wrestle, but I just don't think he's a really high-level wrestler or a grappler for that matter. And I think that's what makes this matchup interesting, because going into this matchup, I was thinking that, this should be a pretty easy win for Griffin if he's able to just really work his wrestling. But I just don't think that Griffin's wrestling is quite at that level. I mean, I was almost ready to hammer Griffin here, but you look at the guys that Condit has lost to, guys that were, holding him down. We got Michael Chiesa, I feel like is a pretty underrated grappler. I don't think he's particularly high level or anything, or even elite, but I think he's very solid, top 10, top 15 sort of guy in terms of, grappling potential. Alex Oliveira, the guy is a really solid grappler as well. He's super inconsistent, but ultimately is a pretty solid fighter, at least at the time, right? Like, I know he's on a bit of a decline, but this was back in, I believe, 2018 when, I think that was when Cowboy peaked. I think he peaked right before in the Medeiros fight, but yeah, I think it's been kind of downhill from there. But this was a cowboy that was still able to get a win over Max Griffin about 2 years later, well past his prime. So at the time, that was a pretty not a bad loss. So before that, Neil Magny, Damian Maia, Robbie Lawler are really high level guys that were able to beat Condit and really just control him with the grappling. And with Griffin, I just don't think he's quite near the level of these guys. I think he's being a little overvalued here in this matchup, if I'm being honest. I don't even think he's going to be the better striker here. I wanted to say that Griffin might be a little bit quicker, a little bit sharper in there, but I'm not even sure if that's entirely true, because this is the same Max Griffin that was getting beat to the punch by Alex Morono. So I think that his last 2 wins kind of overrated him a little bit. And, Ramiz Brahimaj and Kenan Song are all really just low-level fighters. So, yeah, he had 2 good performances, but against low-level guys. And Max Griffin, I don't think he's bad or anything, but I think he's like a journeyman at best. Whereas, Condit, he was, I'd say, elite at one point. And I don't think he's on a big enough decline to the point where Griffin's just going to be able to beat him pretty handily in like the striking. I actually think that Condit might still be the better striker here. I could be wrong. Condit, he could be completely washed, but he hasn't actually looked that bad. So for the striking, I am going to lean towards Condit. Obviously, the grappling, defensive grappling is still a major concern for Condit. But again, I just don't feel that Griffin is a high enough grappler to really punish Condit there. I think that Condit should be able to stuff the takedowns or work his way back up. That said, though, I do slightly lean Griffin in this matchup. I think it'll really come down to how and when Griffin uses those takedowns. I think he can keep it pretty competitive on the feet. And if he's able to just mix in like a takedown near the end of the round and just really solidify that round, I think that he could just win a decision that way. But if he decides to attack the takedown aggressively like he did against Imadaev, that could be an issue, because it looked like he was slowing down that fight. And, if he's really aggressive with his takedowns and his opponents are able to consistently get back up, it's going to be much harder to score that, especially since I do think that Condit might be landing the harder strikes on the feet. So it'll really come down to how Griffin really executes the takedowns. But ultimately, I do have to side with Griffin, because I feel that with the grappling threat, it will open up the striking a little bit more. And just having that in the back pocket is going to be just really valuable for him, especially if it goes to the scorecard. So the pick here is Griffin, but it does feel like the line is a bit wide at this point. I think that Condit likely can win at least one round, and if he's able to really stuff the takedowns in one of the other rounds and keep it on the feet, he could potentially steal a second round as well. So I think the minus 190 is a little bit wide, and I feel that the value is on Condit at this point. Not by too much, though, but if it looks like it's getting even wider, I might have to take a small shot on Condit, just because I feel that really on the feet it's going to be close. And if Griffin isn't able to effectively work his wrestling, I think Condit could steal this fight. So the pick here is Griffin, but I might look to take a shot on Condit. Kicking off the main card, we have Sean O'Malley versus Kris Moutinho, and not much to say about this fight, guys. This is a straight up squash match. Kris Moutinho's the plus 500 underdog, and O'Malley's the minus 900 favorite. Kind of unbettable at this point. Even the props are probably going to be pretty crazy here. O'Malley inside the distance or O'Malley by knockout will probably be pretty juiced as well. But yeah, I'll keep this brief. I don't really think there's too much to break down here. O'Malley, I think he's going to be the far superior striker in there. He's actually, pretty high level despite all of his, antics and stuff. The guy is pretty dynamic on the feet. He moves well. He cuts angles pretty well also. He mixes it up a lot and is very sharp in there. He uses his feints really well, makes really good reads on his opponents. He's super accurate. The really only knock on him is his potential durability issues. The guy's been hurt in a number of fights, and that ankle is really a ticking time bomb. So that is the only concern going into this matchup, but I really don't think it's going to get too far in this matchup. I think O'Malley knocks him out in like the first minute and a half. Moutinho is just not a very good fighter. The guy, he stays busy with his kicks, is honestly pretty sloppy with his striking. He likes to throw a lot of arm punches as well, but just overall, just really bad fighter. They're really spoon feeding him this matchup. Like, of all the short notice fill-ins O'Malley could have gotten, they pick up some regional bum that he's been knocked out 4 times, pretty much knocked out in all of his losses, and they're giving him like a very hand-picked matchup here. I think it's pretty obvious the UFC's pushing O'Malley. They really want him to succeed here, and I get it. The guy's got really flashy moves. He's very fun fighter to watch, but at a certain point, I mean, there's only so many cans you could crush before people want to start seeing something new, right? I don't know, maybe not, but I do want to see some better matchups for Sean. The UFC is kind of slow cooking him, and even the Smolka fight was a very favorable matchup for him. So yeah, I do want to see some tougher matchups for him just to see how he performs against higher level opponents. But I guess he is still pretty young, and the UFC is really just looking to build him up. So yeah, I got O'Malley winning this pretty handily. I think he knocks out Moutinho pretty early here. I'd be surprised if this went past the first round. I think O'Malley round 1 knockout is the play, but I think that's probably going to be pretty juiced. I wouldn't be surprised if it was like minus 150 or even more. Where it stands now. But I think O'Malley cruises. I think he gets another highlight reel KO. Don't think I'll touch this from a betting perspective, though. Minus 800 is pretty egregious, even to put into parlays. I mean, again, the guy's ankles are, I think, a massive liability, so I wouldn't play him straight, but maybe just go heavier on him on DK or something. So O'Malley's the pick, and I think he gets it done. Round 1 knockout. And moving along, we got Yana Kunitskaya versus Irene Aldana. And right now it is a pick'em, minus 110 both ways. And very interesting fight. A fight that I'm actually really curious to see how the judges score it, right? Because I feel like this is going to be a pretty close fight. Lots of back and forth. And I think that whoever wins, there's probably going to be a ton of people crying robbery. So I'm just very interested to see how this plays out. And I feel that this is actually a pretty solid matchup as well. But let's start with Irene Aldana first. So Aldana, she's a very sharp striker, really solid boxing, really stiff 1-2 down the pipe. Very good combination punching. But I think the issue with her is she doesn't really seem to set anything up. She'll consistently throw like the same combinations over and over. Her striking is pretty sharp, but she's not a very layered striker at all. She is able to mask that pretty well by being able to push a really high pace. She throws a lot of volume. A lot of the shots don't land, but it looks a lot better in terms of, the optics, because it looks like she's working a lot more. She's the aggressor usually. So even though, she throws a lot of strikes and a lot of them don't land, it does look a lot better to the judges and to the audience, I think. We did see Pennington have some success against her, holding her up against the cage, but I think people also forget that Pennington, I feel, was landing some pretty hard shots on Aldana as well. So in addition to keeping it pretty competitive on the feet, she was able to use the cage pushing to really solidify the decision. Overall, though, I do actually feel that her takedown defense isn't too bad. She does kind of struggle a bit off her back, but she's not awful there or anything, and she has worked her way back up before, so I don't think that her defensive grappling is bad. It's a little subpar, but I don't think it's completely awful. So yeah, I think that Aldana, she's a good striker with, solid takedown defense and, pretty subpar ground game. But all in all, I think she's a decent fighter. Her opponent, Kunitskaya, is a pretty well-rounded fighter. Her striking is passable, but nothing special. She does do some good work in the clinch and will work in some of the grappling occasionally. But is pretty bad off her back as well. And honestly, I feel she's a little undersized for the division. I could be wrong about this, and maybe it's just because she's kind of pale, but it always looks like she's kind of the smaller fighter in there. That said, though, she is a pretty smothering sort of fighter, so I don't know. I'm not really sure where I was going with that, but taking a look at this matchup, I think this is a really close one. I could see it playing out a number of different ways, but ultimately, I think I'm going to have to side with Aldana here. And the reason for that is because I think on the feet, she's going to be the fighter that's winning much more clearly, right? Like when it comes to the striking, I think it's going to be Aldana who's really going to be pushing the pace. I think she's going to be throwing a lot more. And like I said before, even if a lot of her punches aren't landing, I think it'll look a lot better, to the judges. And the shots that do land, I think will look like they're much more damaging than the shots that Kunitskaya lands, because I feel that Kunitskaya actually doesn't have much power, or, she's, very pillow-fisted. Like, no offense to her, but it doesn't look like her opponents really respect her striking at all. And, optically, it doesn't look like her punches really do that much damage either. So I don't think the judges will really, score the striking in her favor whatsoever. And really, for Kunitskaya to win, she'll have to really use her grappling. And the thing with that, though, is I don't think that Kunitskaya is a very high-level grappler. I think she'll have to resort to just looking to wall install to get the victory here, but I just don't think that's too likely. It seems like people are kind of on Kunitskaya this week. The line has closed up a bit. She was a slight underdog, I believe, a few days ago, and now it's starting to close up. It's at a pick'em right now, so money has been coming in on Kunitskaya, but I kind of feel that Kunitskaya might be a bit of a trap here. She does have the grappling to potentially go to and exploit, and she can do work in the clinch, but I think that Aldana can keep it standing long enough and do enough damage on the feet to really sway the judges to score the rounds in her favor. This honestly kind of reminds me a bit of the Zalal-Woodson fight, where we have a somewhat well-rounded fighter against a striker, and I just feel that the striker is going to do a lot more on the feet, as opposed to the grappler really just holding his opponent up against the cage, landing a few pitter-patter shots. So I kind of see that playing out in this fight. Kunitskaya will probably hold Aldana up against the cage for, a few minutes and maybe land a takedown there, but ultimately not really being able to do much with it. Whereas anytime the fight is on the feet and at distance, I see Aldana just doing a lot more work there. So I got to favor Aldana here. And at, minus 110, I am thinking about taking a shot on her. I might actually lock in a bet after I'm done recording this, because I feel that Aldana should be the slight favorite here. I think that the fight will look like a potential 50-50 sort of fight, especially if you got money on it. But ultimately, I think that even though the fight will play out kind of 50-50, I think the scoring for it will be in Aldana's favor. I think the judges will kind of like the optics of that Aldana gives off a lot more, if that makes sense. So yeah, I think it is a pretty close fight. I think that Kunitskaya will have some moments. She'll have some control time. But ultimately, I think that Aldana will do enough on the feet to win the decision here. So I'm going to go with Aldana, and I have her winning by controversial split decision. All right, moving along, we got Tuivasa versus Greg Hardy, and Tuivasa is the minus 135 favorite. Comeback on Hardy is plus 115. So this is a pretty interesting matchup, but I am a little surprised it's this high up on the card. I know they really want to push Hardy, and they think that this might potentially be a banger because, Tuivasa, he really likes to bring the action. But, I'm not entirely convinced that that's going to be the case. I think this could potentially devolve into just being a pretty sloppy mid-tempo sort of fight. And before I did tape on this, I did see that the fight goes to decision prop was like plus 280. But by the time I'd finished doing tape, it had dropped all the way down to like plus 150, 160. So, before I think that would have been the play. But that line didn't stick around for too long. I think that people are kind of seeing the same thing. I think they see a pretty mid-tempo sort of fight where, both guys have had a history of, bringing the fight. But I think usually when we see these sort of matchups where we have a guy who, does seem to be very explosive, have a lot of power, I think we end up seeing guys they kind of respect each other, the power of the other guy a little too much. And so it becomes a much more methodical sort of fight where both guys are picking their shots a lot better and they're not as aggressive or not as reckless as they usually fight. So yeah, let's start with Tuivasa, right? So this guy's been in the UFC for quite a bit now and is a pretty fun fighter to watch, pretty high action. It's pretty one-dimensional though. He's pretty much exclusively a striker. Pretty one-dimensional in that regard. Does have a nice inside leg kick. have seen him clinch guys, put up guys against the cage and really just work the clinch there. But primarily, he is a striker. His takedown defense is actually not bad. And I actually don't think his ground game is too bad either. I know he did get finished by Spivak on the ground, but he was actually doing a decent job stuffing a lot of the takedowns and working his way back up to his feet. But ultimately, I think he just got tired, and Spivak, he is an absolute grinder in there, was able to eventually finish him. But I actually don't think that Tuivasa's ground game is too terrible. He stuffed a lot of takedowns against Ivanov too, and so yeah, I think his ground game and defensive grappling is actually not too bad. But I don't think it'll matter too much this fight. Hardy is primarily a striker also. He does a pretty good job pumping the jab out. And, he did do a pretty good job keeping De Castro at distance in their fight. And, something I did notice in that fight, though, was he did struggle a bit with the leg kicks by De Castro. And that's definitely something that Tuivasa can look to exploit here. But ultimately, I just feel that Hardy is a pretty one-dimensional fighter, and he is still pretty green. Outside of his striking, he really doesn't have much to offer in terms of just anything else. I mean, his ground game is pretty atrocious. He had no idea what to do when he was taken down, and I don't think his takedown defense is really that good. And as far as level of competition, I don't think that Hardy's really faced anyone of you know what? I'm wrong. He did face Volkov in there, and he did go up against Tybura. But, level of competition, not too bad. But I don't think he's got a quality win at all. He looked kind of decent against Volkov. I was a little surprised that went the distance. But I think Volkov really just kind of played it safe that fight. He didn't really want to get touched by Hardy at all. And I believe this was actually after his Lewis fight where he was knocked out in the last second. So I think he just wanted to kind of cruise here, didn't want to overextend himself. So, Hardy kind of just hung in there, didn't really get much going. But, I think Volkov just played it real safe. I don't think that Hardy's I think if they fought again, I think Volkov could probably put him out knowing how hard Hardy gasses. But I wouldn't rate that loss to Volkov too highly. So, I'm not going to give him too much credit there. And he was able to put it on Tybura early that fight, but ended up, I think, punching himself out. Tybura ended up, getting the takedown in that second round and eventually just finishing him on the ground. I think that's the fight that really exposed the cardio of Hardy. I mean, I think people always had their suspicions. I mean, the guy had to use an inhaler in one of his fights. But, I think this one really just exposed how bad it really was. But taking a look at this matchup, I think this one is actually a pretty tricky fight in my opinion. At first I had really leaned the Tuivasa side, just knowing Hardy's cardio issues and, Tuivasa being the much, I think, more experienced fighter. I think the more technical fighter, but, taking a little, deeper look at this matchup, I think that Hardy's a pretty decent matchup for Tuivasa here. Just because I think that if if Tuivasa isn't able to get any grappling going, I think if it's just a striking match, I think that Hardy will actually do a pretty decent job of potentially managing the distance and really keeping Tuivasa back, really working his jab. Kind of similar to the De Castro fight where anytime De Castro came in close, Hardy was able to kind of just stiff him with the jab and really stifle the volume of De Castro just because he's just such a big guy and, he's got some good power too. So I don't think that Tuivasa is just going to look to blitz into the pocket in fear of potentially, getting hurt by Hardy. That said, though, I do think that Tuivasa is on a much higher level than De Castro. I think the leg kicks are going to be there for Tuivasa, so that's definitely something for him to go to. And Tuivasa really hasn't shown any sort of grappling in the UFC, but I think his best and clearest path to victory here is to look to, work some of the wrestling in there against Hardy. Honestly, really just look to push the pace against him, look to cage push and accumulate a bit of control time. I think the key, honestly, is for Tuivasa to really push the pace against Hardy. And even though I don't think that Tuivasa has the best gas tank, I think he can fight a really solid 3 rounds. In his fight against, Ivanov, it was a pretty high tempo fight, I think. I mean, it wasn't anything crazy, but there was a good amount of grappling going on, a lot of back and forth, and Tuivasa was able to gut it out. So, I don't think his cardio is great, but I do think that it should be better than Hardy's. And I don't usually factor in the training camp too much in these, breakdowns and analysis. But, if he was still at AKA, I would trust him a little bit more to, execute that sort of game plan and have the tools to potentially execute that game plan. But it does look like he's training back at his home gym. So I suspect that there's a good chance he'll just keep it, in the striking. And if that's the case, I think it's a pretty 50-50 fight. I favor Hardy a little bit more to possibly get the knockout early, but Tuivasa has generally shown to be pretty tough. So if this fight goes the distance and is primarily a striking bout, I think that it'll be pretty close. It really will come down to the game plan that Tuivasa comes in with and really his mentality, right? I think that if he's aggressive, really pushes the pace, I think he could win this fight pretty handily, especially since I do think that Hardy will likely start to tire out in a high-paced fight. However, I can also see this being a pretty low-paced fight where early on he feels the power of Hardy a bit and is a bit timid and maybe not look to engage as much because Hardy can do a bit of damage there. So yeah, I think that is a potential outcome, and I do think that Hardy does have some knockout upside. But as far as the pick goes, I think I do still have to side with Tuivasa here. I think he's got all the tools to win this fight. It just really comes down to the execution. So I will have to side with Tuivasa being the much more well-rounded fighter, the much more experienced fighter. And even though he is giving up a good amount of size in there, I think that the skill and the experience should be able to carry him. And moving right into the main event, into the co-main, getting a little ahead of myself here. We have Gilbert Burns versus Stephen Wonderboy Thompson, and Thompson's going to be the minus 190 favorite. Comeback on Burns is plus 165, and this is a very interesting fight, very interesting stylistic matchup in my opinion. We have an elite grappler in Burns versus an elite kickboxer in Thompson. Obviously, a little more nuanced than that, but that is the gist of this matchup. So Wonderboy, like I said, elite kickboxer. He's got fantastic footwork, great distance management. His timing is solid, really good counter punching, and he's really hard to get a read on and close the distance on. The guy's striking is world class, and he doesn't have like massive power or anything, but he does have that, punch you don't see coming sort of power. And even though he's been a bit of a decisionator lately, I do think that his striking is pretty dangerous. I mean, he did drop Luque and Masvidal in his most recent fights. So while he does have that point fighting style, he's still a very potent striker in my opinion. And this definitely can be a bit concerning if you are supporting Burns, since Burns is coming off a pretty nasty KO loss to Usman, where he had him hurt in, I think, one of the rounds, and then I hurt him again and followed up with some pretty nasty ground and pound. So I have a feeling Burns might not have been fully recovered, and he's getting a little older also, and Burns, I feel his chin is, I don't want to say he's chinny, but he has been hurt, he has been dropped before. So the guy's durability or his chin is a little concerning in this fight. So that is definitely something to keep in mind going forward. Burns' striking is, he's got a lot of power, very explosive. I'd say he's got close to fuck you power almost. He was able to drop Usman early, and, he did knock out Maia. And, I mean, the guy is explosive. He's got a lot of power. He's dangerous on the feet. So his striking isn't very layered. It's kind of simple, but he does it really well. And, it is very effective. And he's kind of like Michael Chandler in that sense, where his boxing isn't like elite or anything, but you kind of see this a lot in the Hoof guys. They keep it pretty simple, keep it tight, but it is very effective and very dangerous. As far as his grappling goes, I mean, the guy is elite. He's got a lot of jiu-jitsu accolades and is very dangerous on the ground as well. His wrestling isn't like elite either, but I have seen him go to it, and his wrestling is very solid. But yeah, this is a very interesting matchup because Burns hasn't quite faced anyone with the at the level of striking that Thompson brings, right? And Thompson hasn't faced anyone with the sort of explosiveness that Burns brings on the feet and on the ground. But on the feet and at distance, I do favor Thompson pretty heavily here. I think that if this was pretty much a stand-up fight, I think that Burns will actually get put out. I think that over the course of 3 rounds, if he isn't able to get Thompson up against the fence or get him to the ground, there's a good chance that I think Thompson knocks him out. Because stylistically, as far as the striking goes, I think this is like a perfect matchup for Thompson. He thrives on guys that like to move forward and pressure. He's so good at just getting the timing on them and working the counters. So if this was 100% a stand-up fight, I would expect Thompson to eventually get the read on Burns and just knock him out. But I do think that Burns is going to look to get the grappling going. I don't think he'll look to strike too much. Definitely just strike to maybe set up the grappling. Definitely just threaten that. But overall, I don't think it'd be a good idea to be in prolonged striking exchanges with Thompson. And as far as that goes, I do think that Burns will have a bit of success with the grappling. Wonderboy does have good distance management and footwork, but Burns, he does have, really solid, leg kicking game. And I think that Burns just should be able to crash the distance and get close enough to just get his hands on Thompson, look to hold him up against the cage, and eventually, working the takedowns so he could, get a bit of control time there. And while Burns hasn't faced anyone with quite the level of striking of Wonderboy, it's been a really long time since Wonderboy's faced anyone with, high-level grappling. And you'd have to go all the way back to, I think, 2016. So a good 5 years ago since Wonderboy's fought like a solid grappler, because everyone since then that he's fought has primarily been a striker. So I think this will be a pretty fresh, like, stylistic matchup for both guys. And ultimately, I am going to side with Burns here. I just think that, he's dangerous on the feet and he's dangerous on the ground, but I feel that Burns is also the more well-rounded fighter. And, while Wonderboy, he has got elite kickboxing, this is an MMA fight, and, he's been able to do really well so far, but this is a pretty tough matchup for him, I think. I feel that this should be close to a coin flip fight, maybe a slight lean towards Wonderboy, just because, he is the much better striker, and the fight does start up on the feet. But unless he is able to just piece up Burns and keep the fight standing for 15 minutes, it's going to be hard for him to look like a minus 190 favorite in there. And ultimately, my picks are kind of influenced by how the lines are set. If I feel it's like close to a 50-50 fight, I'm probably just going to side with the dog, especially one like Burns, who is, he's a moderately sized dog at this point. And, at plus 165, and just the skill set that Burns brings, I think he can make this a very close fight. And this could be a fight where I do think he could potentially get the finish as well, because like I said before, Burns is very explosive on the feet. He is, I think, live for the knockout. I don't think it's a very high percentage likelihood, but I think that, if anyone can pull it off, it is Burns. And I do expect Burns to go to the grappling as well. So I think that he'll have a decent amount of success there. I feel that the disparity between the grappling is much more in favor of Burns than the disparity in striking for Thompson, if that makes sense. But ultimately, I just think that Burns should be able to land at least, 1 or 2 takedowns. And I think when he is able to get the fight to the ground, it's going to be a pretty rough time for Wonderboy. And, something to consider also with this fight is that, Wonderboy is also 38, and, he has still looked pretty good so far, but he is slowing down a little bit, and, he has been hurt. He's been injured in a lot of his fights, and, that's not something that, I'm going to bank on happening, but at 38 and with the history of it against, a killer in there like Burns, if, he does get hurt, or if Burns, senses blood at all, he's going to look for the finish. He's got fantastic finishing instinct. And lastly, Wonderboy did go up against Luque before, who is in the same camp as Burns. So I have to imagine they've got some sort of game plan already laid out, and they've probably gotten some of their reps and work in. So I think it's a slight benefit to Burns there, but I wouldn't factor in too much into this breakdown. Anyways, I just think that this should be a pretty close fight, and I think that Burns will likely be able to get this fight to the ground, in which case I do kind of slightly lean him. So I got to go with Burns here, and I actually do have a 1-unit bet placed on Burns. I feel that the line is a bit wide here. I think that with how well-rounded and dangerous Burns is, I feel that he can either win a decision or possibly even get the finish, whether it's standing or on the ground. So I think that Burns, he is the value side here. And in the main event, we have Conor McGregor versus Dustin Poirier. This one's to settle the score, and I'm really looking forward to this fight. I'm really interested to see what kind of adjustments each fighter makes, and that's honestly what makes capping some of these rematches or trilogy fights a little difficult, just because sometimes you see rematches just play out exactly the same, and sometimes they play out completely differently. And what it really comes down to is really the adjustments that each fighter is going to make, because during the 6-month period, I don't think that either has really added too many skills to their arsenal. We kind of know what they both bring to the table already. So Conor, the guy's an elite striker in my opinion. He's got good power, really good accuracy, great timing. He cuts angles well, and defensively his grappling is pretty on point. His takedown defense is actually really solid, and his get-ups are really solid as well. But man, the guy's got pinpoint accuracy and really good timing, and he's got good power too. So I think he's a very dangerous fighter, especially in those first 2 rounds when he's fresh. But that brings me to his cardio, which I feel like is gonna be his biggest weakness. So the guy's got pretty questionable cardio. After the first round and a half or so, the guy starts to slow down pretty significantly. And we did see him go 5 rounds with Diaz, but that was a fight where he was able to pace himself pretty well, but Diaz wasn't really, pressuring him too hard in that fight. And, that's the thing with MMA. Every fighter does have a weakness. And, if Conor didn't have the questionable cardio, he'd be unstoppable, honestly. And, with Poirier, the guy is very high level striker, but, I do think that Conor is still a level above him. And, but, Poirier just brings so many other intangibles to the table. The guy is an absolute dog in there. He's got good durability. And he's taken a lot of damage and has accumulated quite a bit of wear and tear because, he's been in a number of wars, right? But, he's been able to gut it out pretty well in most of those fights. And, he's a pretty well-rounded fighter also. He's got solid wrestling and decent grappling as well, but he's primarily a striker. But diving right into this matchup, so initially I had wanted to talk about the mindset a little bit because I have been seeing this narrative around Conor, saying that he's not as motivated, or, he might have gotten soft now that he's a millionaire. He's not going to, be as motivated to work as hard, knowing that, he's got all this nice stuff at home. And this is something that I've kind of just seen floating around on social media and on a lot of media outlets, actually. And, even some other fighters are saying this as well. But I don't know if I really agree with that sentiment. I feel that people are kind of projecting a bit, because I don't think that money is the motivation here, because this I don't think is the money fight for Conor. I think if he wanted a money fight, he could have probably gone back into boxing again, probably boxed Jake Paul or something, gone for the Diaz trilogy fight. This is, I feel, more of a legacy fight for him. This is a score that he feels needs to be settled, and I feel like that's going to be a big enough motivator as is. But at the end of the day, who knows what the fuck he's thinking? So we can't really just make these assumptions, right? And, I do think that mentality is definitely a factor going into fights, but unless, you're close to him, it's really hard to know that, what his mentality is like going into that fight. So really, we just got to look at this, fight just from a stylistic standpoint. And skill for skill, I think that Conor is the better fighter. I think that, he's the much more dynamic and dangerous striker. I think Poirier might be the slightly better grappler, but, and, he actually did get a takedown against Conor, but I think that was just him kind of catching Conor off guard. And Conor was able to pop back up pretty quickly. And going into this fight, I do think that it would be really smart for Dustin to attack the grappling again, because even if he doesn't have a ton of success there, he is going to work the cardio of Conor a bit when, when he's, looking to grapple. But Conor has faced better grapplers in there, and his takedown defense again is pretty solid, and his get-ups are really good as well. But on the feet, I do favor the striking of Conor quite a bit more. He did get his legs kicked out from under him in his previous fight, but this is something that I do kind of expect him to make some adjustments for, whether it is to, check some of the leg kicks or, fight in a different stance. These are adjustments that I do expect him to make, and I would be a bit shocked if Dustin was just able to kick his legs out again. So if Conor is able to start to mitigate some of the, the kicking game of Poirier a little bit, I think this becomes a much more, I feel, a lopsided fight on the feet. And, I don't want to just chalk it up to the leg kicks, but I feel like that is a pretty big adjustment he can make that could potentially swing the fight, quite a bit in his favor. And, on the feet, I believe in that first round, Conor did have Poirier hurt, and Poirier did admit to that afterwards. And I'm not sure if Conor didn't notice that or if he had just wanted reps in, right? Because, he did mention that, going into that fight, he wanted a bit of, cage time, work off some of the rust, which I feel was actually a pretty bad mentality to have going in, because at the end of the day, you're in a fight and you're in there with a very dangerous guy in Dustin Poirier. So to kind of say that and have that mentality, you're kind of overlooking Dustin, and I feel that was kind of his downfall in that fight. I don't think he took Dustin too seriously in there, and he ended up paying for it. And for all we know, he probably just didn't catch it, because Poirier does have a fantastic poker face, whereas with Conor, his poker face is actually pretty bad. The guy's body language is completely awful when shit's not going his way. But coming into this, I think that the game plan for Conor really should just be to get Poirier out of there early, maybe within the first round and a half, because that's really when he's most dangerous. And if he isn't able to do that, I think that the advantage for Poirier in the later rounds is much more significant. So I expect Conor to have done the tape. The guy frequently talks about, reviewing fights and going over footage and stuff. And he does have solid fight IQ. So this is something I suspect he may have picked up on, when doing a bit of tape or research. And Poirier even admitted to it in the post-fight press conference. And unless this was some crazy, just big brain move by Poirier to leak that information, I do think that he meant it there, that, Conor had him stunned early, and if he had followed up, he probably could have gotten him out of there. But I do think that is the case, and I think that going into this matchup, this is what Conor should look to do. He had him hurt in the second fight, first round, and I think he could do it again. And I think that if he puts the pressure on a little bit more, he could possibly get the early stoppage here. And if he isn't able to do that, I think that going into the second round, he still will be dangerous as well for, I'd say, a good majority of that fight, maybe, late into, the third or fourth minute. So up until then, I do think that Conor is live for the finish. But once it gets past that point is where things get really interesting, in my opinion. I think that towards the latter half of the second round, if Conor doesn't get the finish, Poirier could potentially start turning the tides there. So in the second fight, the leg kicks had gotten to Conor by this point. But in this fight, if Conor is able to avoid those kicks and not get his legs just completely chewed up after the first minute and a half, I think that this would potentially be a big turning point for this fight. I think late into the second round and for the third round, I think Poirier can really start to turn it up and potentially start to pressure and look to get Conor out of there, because, again, Conor doesn't respond to pressure too well. He doesn't have a good poker face either. But, with that being said, I think a lot of Dustin's success was his ability to really just hobble the legs of Conor. In the second fight, Conor's legs were just completely fucked and his mobility was gone. So that limited a lot of what he was able to do on the feet, took away a lot of his footwork, and he eventually just got backed up against the cage and was getting teed off on there. So again, assuming his movement isn't completely compromised in this fight, I don't think that Dustin will be able to just completely tee off on Conor. And that leads me to believe that this fight could potentially squeak to a decision. I don't think it's super likely. I do think that Conor's got a ton of finishing upside in the early rounds, and I do think that Poirier does have a little more finishing upside in the later rounds as well. But I think for that to happen, Dustin will really have to push the pace on Conor in the later rounds and, just be really aggressive there. However, that second fight was actually a pretty mid-tempo fight. It wasn't like an absolute war or anything. And up until Conor's legs just completely gave out, it was a pretty even, like kind of back and forth sort of fight. So I don't think it's super likely, but I do envision a scenario where this is really just back and forth 5-round sort of affair. But, as far as an official prediction goes, I think that Conor gets the knockout in the first round. I think that's probably what the game plan is going in, and I do believe he's got the skills to pull it off in the first round there. And, obviously don't look to overextend too much, but do put on the pressure a bit. If that doesn't work out, then maybe look to pace yourself, in which case I do see Conor winning round 1, round 2, losing round 3, possibly getting finished in the 3rd or 4th round. That is a potential outcome. But, if he doesn't there, I think that he could still potentially catch like a second win, either maybe sometime in the 4th round or the 5th round. So if this somehow ekes to a decision, I feel that he'll have at least banked the first 2 rounds, possibly catch second wind in the one of the championship rounds to win a very unlikely decision. But I do think Conor gets it done either in the 1st or 2nd round, but I'm siding with that 1st round. I might look to possibly hedge out of this with like Poirier by round 3 knockout or Poirier round 4 knockout. Outside of that, though, I do have a 1.5 unit bet placed on Conor. I do believe that he's got a lot of finishing upside, and if it somehow goes to a decision, I kind of slightly lean him to. But I do think that the finishing upside is there for him. But yeah, those are my thoughts on the main event. Let me know what you guys think about this. I know this is probably a pretty controversial fight. I know a lot of strong opinions when it comes to Conor. So let me know what you guys think. And that'll wrap it up for this edition of the podcast here. And I was getting a little lazy with the sign-offs in the last few episodes. I think I just completely left them out. Got to be a little more diligent about that. But yeah, if you guys found any of this information useful or interesting, just give me a like and subscribe. It really does help out the channel. And, I was just kind of clowning around earlier, but I am very happy about the fact that, we finally did hit 100 subscribers here. Really appreciative of all the support so far. And believe it or not, I actually do put a good amount of work into this podcast. So if you found any of this enjoyable or useful at all, just hit that like and subscribe button. It will really help out the channel because, at the end of the day, I do want to grow this channel a bit. And honestly, seeing the channel grow is pretty motivating for me because, I want to continue giving out or providing good content, giving good analysis and breakdowns. I don't want to be giving out shit picks and, shit breakdowns, especially as the audience starts to grow, right? It honestly kind of pushes me to continuously look to improve and really just refine the process. So yeah, shout out to anyone who's made it this far. I think I got to wrap it up now. I think this might be one of the longest podcasts I've recorded here. So yeah, gonna wrap it up here. Best of luck, everyone, and I hope you guys enjoy the card.